When we think of philosophy, we almost certainly entertain it in Western context, from the Greeks to German philosophers such as Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche, individuals such as Spinoza, Locke, Thomas Hobbes, all the way to more contemporary thinkers such as Sartre, Baudrillard, and Deleuze. When we feel like escaping that hyper-specific vein in Western philosophy, it's appealing to focus on Eastern philosophy and thinkers, areas such as Confucianism, Mohism, or Taoism as such examples. Yet I want us to look at something further, a multifaceted framework that I believe we often fail to ignore. That's Indigenous philosophy. And primarily for this video, North American, Native American philosophy. Indigenous cultures exist everywhere, with varied interpretations of self, society, spirituality, but the one primary constant among them, and to similar extents, Eastern philosophy, is its hyper-interdisciplinary approach to philosophy. Unlike Western counterparts, Indigenous philosophy exists far less in isolation. Segmentation in philosophy, things such as epistemology, metaphysics, political theory, and even outside of philosophy proper, its modern academic separation from areas such as the sciences and other humanities. There are certainly caveats to this, and segmentation can be seen as a symptom of Western academia at large. If anything, though, Western philosophy is inherently more interdisciplinary than most other academic disciplines here. But with Indigenous philosophy, there are no caveats. Everything, in a sense, is philosophy. That's the baseline here. That's a large part as to why I find Indigenous philosophy to be very interesting. It differs in such a way that allows itself to flexibly sit between every facet of life. My goal here with pointing out some holes in Western philosophy isn't to put Indigenous philosophy inherently above it, but that even with philosophy as a whole, there's a monumental ton of value in understanding Indigenous philosophy. With this, and aside from the intrinsic differences we see in Indigenous philosophy, I find its material relationship with modernity also grants us a far more radical inlook into systems of power and commerce. Things such as the state at large as well. American history has always been incredibly near and dear to my heart. And with that, Native American culture has always been at the forefront. If we are doing American history correctly, it must be. And with media stereotypes, that has not always been the case. For this video, there is certainly a moral weight here that I take seriously. Really, so much of my personal morality has been carved from the happenings around Native American history and the spread of colonialism around the world. Concepts such as justice, injustice, morality, forged specifically from looking beyond cultural images that are presented to us at a young age. Things like cowboys and Indians, Indigenous people incorrectly visualized as a mere backdrop to American history, rather than the American history itself. Because of this, I find it completely impossible to talk about Indigenous philosophy in isolation, outside their historical and present struggles. You simply cannot. And even to this day, we are still seeing the furtherance of racism and blatant assaults on Indigenous communities, things that these communities at large constantly face.
What do the numbers show? How much does it affect this minority group?
According to reports from the CDC, a lot.
When Native people confront the police, they are killed at a higher rate than any other demographic in the United States.
One case that did capture attention involved a Puyallup tribal member, Jackie Sawyers. A Tacoma police officer nearly 5 years ago killed this mother of four who was also pregnant with her fifth child. Agonizing questions about that night, including how did a nearby security camera happen to not be working right at the time of the shooting.
But in this case, this was not caught on camera, right?
So there were cameras, but they all seemed to malfunction at that time.
Further, some of these things hit a bit closer to home. While I am not Indigenous, my wonderful wife is. My wife is part Dakota, specifically from the Sisseton-Wahpeton tribe, a tribe where most of its members reside on the Lake Traverse Reservation in South Dakota. Yet, my wife's experience, as well as her father's, is akin to being ripped from something that they didn't completely know was theirs. Even if what we may see as merely generationally distant, that's a violent phenomenon to contend with in the present. A type of systemic antagonism coming from the very systems we're taught as our best interest. From the little I've seen, this seems to be a common theme, something that more and more young people are highlighting. Personally, my ancestry is a mix of Scot, Irish, and Northern European. In many ways, I have rarely concerned myself with this. It doesn't really play a role in my life. Yet I cannot confidently say that that wouldn't be the case under different circumstances. I am only me. For them, for individuals of Palestinian, Irish, African, Armenian, Jewish, Aboriginal, and Indigenous American descent, there are real reasons why they cannot merely speak about their heritage in isolation, something outside the vein of raw colonialism and genocide. And for the people who deem the material and historical context of these people as an attack on their own identity, I think it wise to take a step back and put yourself in their shoes. Before we get started, I am narrowing down this video, as stated earlier, to focus on North American indigenous cultures, primarily found within the modern borders of the United States. As much as I find the Mayans, Inuits, and Aztecs incredibly interesting and a potential subject for a later video, I can only fit so much into one video, and this is where most of my knowledge on the subject lays. And, well, I live in the United States, thus there's a much more direct relationship. With the preliminary out of the way, let's get into the bulk of the video.
Was to understand that Native people have always had a psychology, but it was more traditional, today's psychology, textbook psychology, if you will, concentrates on the mind and the thought process, whereas traditional psychology deals with the heart and the heart process.
Dissecting North American, Native American philosophy is very difficult for two main reasons. Thousands of tribes existed within nations, and nations overlapped each other throughout the North American continent. If I had to guess why there's so little excursion into indigenous philosophy, it's because of this. Simply put, there's a ton of variance amidst Native American organization. The second is that Native Americans didn't rely on written documents. They primarily relied on oral tradition, seen through rituals, ceremonies, story, dance, and song. Yet the form in which philosophy was practiced, and even the content, was congruent across different cultures and tribes. Now, I always like to approach philosophy from an interdisciplinary perspective, but for this video, it's especially the case. This video will be as much of an excursion into the anthropological and sociological as it is the philosophical and the self. I think the first thing to start off on is the concept of self within an indigenous context. Looking at self and the Western categories imposed within a Western context always seems to anger a ton of people. And I suppose I will preface this section by saying that your idea of self, things such as gender, sex, ideas of individuality, exist within a very specific Western framework that has only existed within the smallest fraction of history. Things like man, woman, sexual categories of gay, straight, constructions of self within career, occupation, or trade. These things are all a blip within the various ways humans have organized themselves throughout history and forged their identities therein. While I don't want to make a moral argument on this topic specifically, this video will require deeply unseating ourselves from this present. We often think of our current Western lived experience as the rational system geared most towards human nature. Yet things like liberal democracy and capitalism are present, makes up a tiny percent of the systems that have been organized since human civilization. And an even starker irony, given our sociology, is that the strict categories we have traditionally adhered to have been at increasing odds with new scientific progress.
In school biology, we usually learn that the sexes in humans are fixed and concrete. Whether you're male or female is black and white and rooted in your DNA. Your 23rd pair of chromosomes is either 2 X chromosomes or an X and a Y. That's it. End of story. And that's essentially what scientists thought too. But it turns out that sex isn't that straightforward. In fact, biologists today are saying sex is a spectrum.
Researchers, as time goes on, are finding that non-Western constructs of self, gender, sex, and sexuality are ironically more scientifically and biologically consistent with indigenous standards than our traditional Western standards. This alone is beyond the scope of the video, and for the sake of not making the most annoying, insecure people on the internet angry, we'll shift focus to the various ways indigenous cultures in North America conceptualize self. Okay, onto the self. Here is one curveball. In North American indigenous philosophy, there really isn't a concept of self, at least in the ways that we are typically used to and recognize. There's an academic term for this indigenous sense of self known as transformative model of identity, a processual view of self that emphasizes being a part of community, a nation, a tribe, and living amidst that process. While under many different names, this is a consistent foundation amongst tribes around North America. One common name for this is circle of life. The Pueblo peoples found primarily in New Mexico visualize this with a hieroglyph of spirals. In conjunction to typical modern Western thought, self isn't an I, nor identity fixed in time, within category. Indigenous self is a we within process. Granted, I'm sure much of my audience knows that thinkers such as Spinoza, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger see self difference from Anglo-normative Western philosophy. Much of what is the current baseline in our own culture. Further, the sense of self in an indigenous context exists within nature, deeply so. In the Western world, there is a tradition of categorization, thus a tendency to lean towards binary ideas of difference and duality, ways we can, in a sense, logically understand things. And I want to reiterate here, there are upsides to this approach, but in a Western sense, we often exist outside of nature, or on top of it as a separate entity. It's the opposite in many indigenous cultures. Self and personhood, and by proxy, community, is deeply embedded in nature. Names such as Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Red Cloud. Their names aren't direct translations, but in their native tongue, descriptions of their temperament, events in their life, or happenings. That often takes descriptive form of things within nature, though. For example, Crazy Horse in Lakota roughly translates to his horse is crazy. Personhood, the self, is reflective of extreme materiality. Contrast this in the Western world, where names, particularly last names, often come from occupation or given roles. This may be a loose interpretation here, but we can see a contrasting Western and indigenous difference with nomenclature, and a Western focus on a type of idealism. When we look at it this way, we can see native cultures saw transcendence through connection and with nature and balance, with an emphasis in communal relationship. While certainly a working thesis, and not a fact, I find this to highlight some metaphysical differences, one where the West finds synergy and idealism, while indigenous North American cultures may find organization and life in the context of a stark materialism. Here's one such interesting example. The Iroquoian nation, sorry if I pronounce that incorrectly, have a metaphysical belief called Orenda, which roughly translates to spiritual power. But this sense of power, or energy, can be described as a mesh that is inherent in all life and earth. From the energy of a storm to emotional dispositions of people. This energy, or spiritual matter, is, to the Iroquois, a spiritual phenomenon, yet still deriving directly from nature. Further, many North American native tribes roughly adhere to the concept of the Great Spirit, or as many indigenous individuals argue, the Great Mystery. The Lakota call this the Wakan Tonka. On the flip end, in Western civilization, typically Abrahamic religion, we see spiritual phenomenon derives from a figure that's beyond nature, a sovereign, monolithic king-like figure who resides elsewhere, another spiritual realm such as heaven. In an indigenous context, spirituality is seen as something that spawns from and is tethered to material nature and earth. Further, I quite like the approach and verbiage of the Great Mystery. It's quite rare that we see a spirituality that posits such an emphasis, quite literally in name, around discovering or mystery itself rather than doctrine. We mentioned earlier things around gender and sexuality. While varying from tribes and nations within North America, we can roughly see a system that saw equivalence of man and woman, but importantly, these were never set constructs, but a part of a total fluid spectrum. We've also seen the indigenous construct of two-spirit, a term based on the older anthropological term of burdock, which, like many Western descriptors around indigenous life, were considered derogatory.
But more importantly, to educate about the history and how Two-Spirit people were a part of all of these, indigenous and native histories that for the most part was wiped out as a result of colonization.
The North American continent and the indigenous people or First Nations people there identifying as Two-Spirit, but then also the larger tribe believing that these individuals are integral to the whole community as medicine people, as warriors, as...
Yeah, they were the name givers, they were the negotiators, they were, the ceremonial leader. And it varied, again, from tribe to tribe, depending on the type of roles and responsibilities that they had.
Two-Spirit refers to a third gender of a person with a role of a healer, warrior, and mediator. Someone who encompasses an overlap between the masculine and the feminine. That said, describing Two-Spirit as merely a third gender is actually a Western abstraction to make sense of an indigenous concept of gender, which, again, doesn't really exist as a concept or category altogether. The epistemology is completely different. Remember, as Western people, we innately categorize things as to make sense of them, and that's a huge part of our epistemological systems. Yet, in an indigenous context, categorization wasn't a part of their systemic makeup. I find one of the absolute best texts on indigenous philosophy is How It Is from Viola Cordova, one of the very first indigenous women to receive a PhD in philosophy. She states, "There is no awareness here by the Western thinker that other peoples are denied the claim to be pursuing a valid lifestyle by virtue of having been placed on the Western hierarchical scale of being. The actual diversity of the human species is denied. There is only one correct lifestyle, that of the contemporary European. The concept of a singularity, such as the term mankind signifies, is a pernicious concept. It flies in the face of the actuality that human beings do exhibit different means of adapting to the diverse circumstances offered by the planet. The concept ignores also the fact that the Earth exhibits tremendous diversity, not only in environmental circumstances, but in the plethora of creatures and vegetation that occupy those environmental niches. Throughout this entire video, we've been processing these things through a very specific metaphysical lens. I've hinted at it throughout, but that lens is monism, the metaphysical view that everything, matter, life, what have you, relates back to a singularity. That might be God, that could be the universe, that could be Earth, what have you. Monism isn't merely an indigenous or Eastern entity. A few throughout the West history have posited the same system. Individuals such as Spinoza as one such example. We've covered this approach with some prior videos, link above, but in an indigenous context, this is incredibly present. And in some ways, this is the most lived version of monism that we can point to, from their social organization, spirituality, to the small behavioral minutiae. There is a heavy adherence to this metaphysical foundation, to such an extent it's quite jarring compared to the multivariate structures we find in the West. And again, I like that there is an impetus towards variance in a Western context. But as pointed out with Cordova and in prior critical theorists, it's never really that simple. Amidst the multivariate ideological approaches, we often find hegemony. And with a monistic indigenous approach, we can find an ironic diversity within that singularity. As an anecdote, my wife volunteered and spent time with a tribe in South Dakota within the Cheyenne River Reservation. One thing she took away was the raw emphasis on life as a direct material experience. I'll explain what I mean here. Whenever new people within the reservation were introduced to horses to ride horseback, they never merely threw a saddle on and let the person and the horse ride off. They had people momentarily ride without a saddle and emphasized the importance of horses as beings with agency, real breathing animals. Of course, you don't need to ride a horse without a saddle to technically know horses are alive. But do you really get the full brunt of understanding of this by merely explaining it? Now, I know other people outside of indigenous tribes may do this, but it makes sense there is a value of ritual and practice that aims to connect you directly in indigenous context, as their epistemology varies greatly from the West. Learning and understanding lives within tactility is present here. Now, tactile experiences and ritual also isn't merely an indigenous construct, but in the West, elaboration, explanation, and incision is an institution. We must think about how we approach education, a set, standardized machine, one reflective of production and abstract reasoning. To an indigenous approach, think about the form. The form serves as a mode of domination in the West. Domination by interrogative understanding, by way of placing oneself above or outside of nature. But we're going to take a step back here to our last video. This video was over Cormac McCarthy, and Cormac McCarthy highlights this type of dichotomy in his text Blood Meridian. There's a reason I am covering indigenous philosophy after a video on McCarthy. There are huge overlaps and influences here. Blood Meridian highlights this type of domineering impetus with a conversation between two characters, the kid and the judge.
Whatever exists, he said, whatever in creation exists without my knowledge, exists without my consent. He looked about at the dark forest in which they were bivouacked. He nodded toward the specimens he'd collected. These anonymous creatures, he said, may seem little or nothing in the world, yet the smallest crumb can devour us. Any smallest thing beneath yon rock out of men's knowing. Only nature can enslave man, and only when the existence of each last entity is routed out and made to stand naked before him will he be properly suzerain of the earth.
To understand, to educate in a historical Western context is to impose oneself as an exterior force, something at odds with nature. Is this not the traditional goal of Western institutions? To build oneself up as an independent, great, capable, and ultimately domineering monolith. This is precisely how re-education of indigenous people was and is such a violent phenomenon in their eyes. Domination wasn't an empowering phenomenon. Even without the physical violence it took to debase them from their homelands and siphon them off into reservations, to an indigenous approach, seeking to understand nature as to impose yourself upon it is to destroy the very fabric of all life. From industry, drilling oil, to experimenting on live animals, industry, polluting, to abstract politics by way of decimation of buffalo populations. They, and in their eyes, we, are not separate from the land, the sky, the water, from nature itself. Thus, this mode of progress, of reason, of education, is a part of a process that simultaneously destroys. The relationship with self in an indigenous philosophy is incredibly powerful in my eyes. But I want to preface here, this does not really have to be at odds with an investigation in a Western context in my mind. However, I think there bears a weight of responsibility here, even in light of established liberal traditions. There is an impetus here with an indigenous context that are incredibly aware of their own limits. Not only aware, but radically accepting of them as well. And perhaps because of this, we're seeing some indigenous conclusions of self being validated in that very modern scientific context. I say this because having pre-established notions of nature, a spiritual or religious construction not upon set doctrine, but questions themselves, i.e., the great mystery we brought up earlier. Wrapping this up, I really hope we don't see a unique indigenous materialist view of spirituality or a sense of self rooted in process being overshadowed by the prospect of Western philosophy coming to similar conclusions, which totally isn't to say that Western philosophy or science should not come to those very same conclusions. But as we stated, that's already happening and it's an existing prospect. I just hope that we can preserve the incredibly special, unique properties of indigenous culture, from their ways of life to their philosophy, as something that originated on its own, before Western continental philosophy, and conclusions found within modern science proper. Thank you all for watching and making it to the end. This video was a long time coming, and I'm happy to finally make it a reality. As always, I couldn't do this without the wonderful people over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel and receive some cool perks like voting on future videos, early access, consider signing up with the link below. I also want to give a giant shout out to these patrons: Jay Roberts, Cedric Watman, and Kate. You guys have gone truly above and beyond, and I really do appreciate the support beyond words. As for everyone else, I hope to see you in the next.